Thank you so much, Serenity, for your leading, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting me um, to speak. That it's really an honor. I love that there's a meeting in Ireland. I am Peggy, compulsive eater and food addict, and I weigh and measure 3 meals a day off the gray sheet, and I commit those meals to my sponsor. I don't eat in between, no matter what. Abstinence is the most important thing in my life without exception. And one day at a time, I have to put this program first in my life. And I am here to build a defense against the first compulsive bite. And yes, I have a long mantra. I know it takes up half my qualification time to say it, but everything in the mantra has deep and profound meaning to me. And I have to confess, when I came into Cambridge Gray Sheet 45 years ago, almost in April of 1979, hearing the mantra imprinted on me so profoundly. I've never had a day since then where at a Gray Sheet meeting I didn't say the mantra. The mantra is a communication code. It's a tribal connection. It says to me, you too are a desperate case when it comes to food, and you too know that your life depends on this, and that you understand that Gray Sheet works because we understand it's only for desperate cases. And I need to know that about other people. I need to know that we're all in this together, because this is the beautiful thing about Gray Sheet, is that it is a perfect solution to an extreme disease. There is a perfect symmetry. Whenever people complain about, quote, the extremity of what we do in Gray Sheet, if it's a Gray Sheeter, I will say. If it's not a Gray Sheeter, I will ignore them. But if it's a Gray Sheeter, I will say, well, how extreme was your disease? And they say, well, I couldn't stop eating. And how many other things did you try? I tried everything there was. And did any of them work? No. And does Gray Sheet work? Yes, Gray Sheet works. There's a perfect symmetry between the extremity of the disease and the, shall we say, the guardrails of what the Gray Sheet provides. And they are the guardrails of freedom. One of the big things for me when I couldn't stop eating and when I was eating compulsively is that I was always either on a diet or binging my brains out. And usually the tipping point from being in the diet to binging was a sort of F it moment. Just F it. I can't stand it anymore. The craving is too much. Life is too much. Just F it. And I would engage in what I call fake freedom. It would be, especially would happen in contexts where if I was, one of the fake freedom sites for me was airports, because I didn't know anybody. Nobody knew me in airports. And I would engage in just this wild binging where I could do it openly, whereas most of my life I binged secretly, of course. That's fake freedom. What Gray Sheet gives me by giving me guardrails is it gives me real freedom. So I wanted to say just a couple of things today in the short time I have. One of the things that we say that newcomers find really extreme is we say abstinence is the most important thing in my life without exception. And when people hear that, they often get really weirded out. They think it means that, you're going to let your kid go hit by a car, if it means you have to interrupt your meal, really perverse, psychopathic things like that. That isn't what it means. It doesn't mean that at all. What abstinence is the most important thing in my life without exception means, as I interpret it, because this is how I relapsed when I got abstinent. I was abstinent in Cambridge, Mass, the mothership, for 5.5 years in the 1980s, and 5.5 years was very long in those days, not like today. what happened to me, this is a cunning and baffling disease, because what happens is that when you're eating, when I was eating, had no life. I was not one of these people who could eat to sort of get through the day. I was a smoker, and I smoked to get through the day. That was the smoking. Eating was exactly the opposite. Eating was the shutdown, the getting under the bed, under the covers, pulling down the shades, and just absolutely disappearing and wanting to die. And I was in graduate school, and I was about to get kicked out of graduate school because I couldn't take my exams. I couldn't pass. I had all incompletes. It was a disaster. I had only gotten in because of being on a diet for a few days. I'd been able to write an application. And I was going to get kicked out of graduate school. And when I got abstinent, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I could focus. I could function in between meals. And slowly, what happened was that my life as a graduate student began to flourish, and I was able to start passing exams. I was able to start writing my dissertation, doing these sort of graduate school things. That's what abstinence does. And the disease of compulsive eating is cunning and baffling, because what happens when you get abstinent is you get this life. And what this life does is it often deceives you into thinking that you're good at life now, and therefore you don't have to be as totally focused on abstinence. It's a little bit like going out in the rain with an umbrella and not getting wet and thinking, oh, I'm not getting wet. I guess I don't need this umbrella anymore. So what happened was Saturday morning meeting, which was, church, so to speak, of Gray Sheet. Well, that was I'm a morning person, and that was the only time I could focus clearly in front of my computer. So I started missing Saturday morning meetings. And the way that I sum it up is there's abstinence and there's life. And abstinence has a whole lot of Gray Sheet rules. Thank goodness. But they're rules. We have to go to meetings. Back in Cambridge, we had many, 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 many meetings, 2 and 3 a day. And it was unheard of that people didn't go to a meeting a day. And now with Zoom, there's no excuse for not going to a meeting a day. But what was happening was that the rules of life, they're completely the opposite from Gray Sheet rules. They have to do with looking normal and behaving normally and not making an idiot of yourself by putting out a scale in front of other people, and all these norms and demands. So the demands of graduate school were, oh, you have to work on Saturday morning because you're going to, get kicked out of graduate school if you don't finish your thesis. And there's all these other rules. So I think of them as like two competing systems because they don't dovetail perfectly. Often it means having to put, they conflict, because proper graduate school behavior might mean, if I put them parallel, missing a meeting. Abstinence is the most important thing in my life means that I can't treat them as parallel. I have to establish a hierarchy. Rules of abstinence have to be the priority over the rules of life. I just sort of came to this in the last few months because I kept noticing that people were sort of adjusting and saying things like, instead of saying abstinence was the most important thing in their life, they would say, abstinence is weighing and measuring is the most important practice that I perform in a day. Something like that, which really waters it down, in my opinion, because it's a way of saying, well, I'm really not going to let my kid get killed in front of a car if it means interrupting my meal. I mean, in other words, somehow it was freaking people out to recognize that. So when I say abstinence is the most important thing in my life, what it means is that it's more important than anything, and therefore it has to take priority. And I have to miss that morning in front of my computer if it means, if the alternative is missing that Saturday morning meeting. I have no choice, because what happened, I got my graduate degree, thank you, Sarah, and I picked up the food the very day, within 2 hours of being handed my degree that I thought was the most important thing. And now this, it could be anything. For some people, it's being, it's dealing with a stressful job and getting a promotion. For other people, it's family related things. I have to work out a relationship or I'm going to get divorced. It could be anything that we end up somehow slowly, unconsciously putting those sort of demands ahead of abstinence. And what you don't realize is that the only reason that I can even have that dilemma is because I'm not eating compulsively. When I picked up the food, and I wasn't even out of my cap and gown, that's how sad it was after 5.5 years. When I picked up the food, my life fell apart within hours. It was a 3.5 year bite. 3.5 years it took me to get abstinent again. And when I got abstinent again, I started saying, one day at a time, I have to put this program first, or anything I put before it, I will lose. And that's what I learned the hard way, that anything I put before it, I will lose. So what helps me, we say, don't eat no matter what. But we don't always say is, how do you not eat no matter what? To tell someone not to eat no matter what, it's fine, but we need to know how. Well, there are the mechanics, and thank you, Sarah and others who wrote Living Abstinent, who gave us the mechanics, so many of the mechanics about how to stay abstinent. But we also need to know the psychological mechanics of how to not eat. And for me, the most important psychological mechanic, so to speak, to not eat is to always put abstinence in front of every other thing. And when which always boils down to getting onto a meeting, calling a GreySheeter, calling your sponsor, no matter what time of day is, being connected. And always prioritizing GreySheet, always prioritizing it. And when it comes down to it, I have to say, and this is one of my favorite slogans, and I learned this from my GreySheet sponsor, who was the founder of Cambridge GreySheet, Sally D. She said, the most important slogan you can ever tell yourself or hear is the words, and then what? Three simple words. Because when I think about the end of a meal, and I don't know about you, but the meal ending is really a tragedy. I mean, I find endings to be so hard. The only way I get through an ending is by jumping up and brushing my teeth. And but when I find endings just to feel unbearable, that I just want to eat some more, I say, and then what? And I play out the scenario. And I had so many years of hopeless, desperate eating. I know exactly what's going to happen. I will end my life. I will end my life, because every breath that I take today depends on being able to end that meal and having that space in between. So what I've learned about endings is that if you don't have the end of a meal, then there's never going to be another beginning. And the beginning of the next meal, there's always another meal coming. The beginning of the next meal is like the sun rising. It's like the most glorious moment of all is the beginning, that first bite of our next GreySheet meal. But I'll never get that again. So if I pick up the food, because then there's no end, there's no beginning, there's just blackness, hopeless despair. So the reason to celebrate endings is that that's how we get beginnings.